literally after a couple of hours, I was successfully finding multiple 0 days across multiple major security projects. And I was shocked. I'm a CISO at Sysdig running a security IT threat research teams. And yeah, spending as well a lot of time trying to discover what's going to happen with all the EI stuff.
Was there a specific moment or data point that made you feel like the existing ways of communicating the problem weren't working?
So whenever you're receiving a patch, you're pretty much receiving a blueprint to the exploit because the patch is trying to patch the exploit. And I was initially shocked, but then after a couple of trials, it was pretty clear. The situation doesn't look very good right now.
What does it say about our industry that every one of these warnings has been ignored for 20 plus years? Is it a failure of imagination?
Obviously, we need to invest in much more safer, secure software, but on the other hand, it means it's not going to help.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Sergej Epp. Sergej, thanks for being here.
Hey, Chris, great to be back at the show.
Yeah,
How are you doing?
it's been a while, but you've been busy, to say the least. But for folks that don't know you, don't know your team and what you're up to, can you give us a bit of a background before we dive into things here?
Yeah, sure, Chris. I'm a CISO at Sysdig running security IT threat research teams. And spending as well a lot of time trying to discover what's going to happen with all the EI stuff out there.
Yeah, you and I both. It's all moving so quick. We actually just met physically in person at Unprompted last week, which was awesome to get the chance to meet in person. But I'm having you on because you created this site called the 0 Day Clock, and I wrote an article about it, made a video about it. But I wanted to hear from the man who made it himself. For folks who haven't checked it out, but what's the genesis of this 0 Day Clock? I know it synthesizes 3,500 CVE exploit pairs. It's essentially a real-time indictment on the industry, in my opinion. What motivated you to build this? Was there a specific moment or data point that made you feel like the existing ways of communicating the problem weren't working, or what led to you creating this?
Yeah, I mean, quite a fun story, Chris. A couple of weeks ago, I started to hear from a lot of friends how easy it became just to look for vulnerabilities by using AI, and this thing's becoming really reliable. And I've just wanted to try out. So I've set up my own lab on Sunday, literally just using one of the AI models, a bit of scaffolding, back and forth, static and dynamic analysis, using some of the tools. And literally after a couple of hours, I was successfully, finding multiple 0 days across multiple major security projects. And I was shocked initially. There was a lot of slope around that, and slope in the sense that some of these vulnerabilities were existing, but they were already known. But there were quite some interesting surprises. So, and this led me to go back and, just try to understand, what if I'm as not professional in this domain, I've not touched any fuzzers or other tools for the last decade. What if I can do this? What are we going to see with other professional people out there, right? What can they do this? And what does it mean as well to our industry? What does it mean to the way how we run security? That's the background story. So I just thought, hey, let me go back and understand, since how many years where we're trying to educate people about that specific problem, and wanted to measure this as well. And this is where I've just had a couple of agents go out and collect all the data and do a couple of statistical analysis around that. And I was initially shocked, but then after a couple of trials, it was pretty clear. The situation doesn't look very good right now.
Yeah, definitely not. And I'll pull up an image of the dashboard here in a moment. But something else you discussed in a piece that you wrote that I really enjoyed is you dubbed what you call the Verifier's law. You use this to explain that AI is accelerating offense faster than defense, and offense, you say, has the cheapest verifier in cyber. Because the feedback is binary and instant, right? How does that framework shape how you think about what defenders should be investing in right now if the verification asymmetry can't easily be closed on the defensive side? We see a lot of excitement around AI and cybersecurity for defensive purposes too, whether it's AppSec, GRC, AI SOCs, all the different categories, right? Like, how do you think about how should defenders be approaching that, knowing that the verification law, the verifier's law, I should say, is at play there?
Yeah, right. I mean, Chris, just trying really to learn over the last 2 to 3 years more about AI, Gen AI, and I have a bit of a AI background, but I'm far away from all of the experts out there, you'll find out very quickly that the most important part for every AI is just to have a proper verifier, proper validation architecture. This goes back to all the experiments of DeepMind between AlphaGo and AlphaZero. Pretty much every field which is trying to invest into good AI models, first of all, tries to understand how do we benchmark, how do we measure, how do we create a proper validators as well for this domain. So for all the benchmarks which we've seen in other domains like mathematics, physics, whatever, these benchmarks were really really solved by AI over the last few years to a really good degree. So in the end, it comes all down to the verifiers and validators for AI to succeed. Back beginning of last year, there was a very nice write-up from a researcher from OpenAI, specifically about the verifiers law and mapping down all the different problems we have out there to two domains: the space of the problem, so how many, what's the complexity of the solutions of the space, and the verification and the complexity of the verification. And two examples in the space just to sort of illustrate this as well to everybody. If you take Sudoku, Sudoku has a pretty large solution space, but then it's very easy to verify when somebody solves Sudoku. That's a perfect example for AI to solve that. The counterexample to that is diet. If you have a specific diet, you decide to change the diet, you will see the effects of the diet just after a couple of weeks or months. So now what I've tried to do is to apply this approach to cybersecurity, and specifically to the two domains in cybersecurity is offense and defense. And now what we've seen last year already from a lot of AI, offense companies and also defense companies, Google, Microsoft, for them trying really to understand how can we scaffold the AI systems to build the validators in cybersecurity in both domains. But I think what was very obvious from the observations last year, offense is dominating and becoming very cheap in terms of validation. So whenever you pop a shell, whenever you exfiltrate data, whenever you run an exploit, for instance, dynamically by validating specific vulnerabilities, or you test the cross-site scripting with a browser, it's a very deterministic validators. So it's very easy for AI to validate if it's doing the right thing and then sort of jump to the next step. In the defense space, it's much more difficult, right? Take SIM, what I call the suspicious information every minute. It's very hard just to looking at the SIM to understand what is happening out there, even if you get certain hints by the AI. And I think that's what the cybersecurity verifiers law is about. Offense is cheap. Defense is very expensive in terms of validation. Therefore, we see much more acceleration around offense in the cybersecurity domain, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We've seen a lot of interesting insights of finding exploits, finding vulnerabilities, automating the creation of exploits. And that's just a technical angle you talked about, from the verification aspect on the defensive side. But there's internal politics, competing priorities and incentives, all the kind of non-technical things that we know are at play, right, when it comes to remediation and so on too. And also, it's, as you said, it's easy to verify in offense, where it reminds me of different papers that talked about cybersecurity. One compared to a market for lemons, another I've seen it compared to a market to silver bullets, because it's kind of hard to prove, right, that products work. Environments are complex and so on. So I think AI is only exacerbating that longstanding challenge that we've already had. I wanted to ask you too, you also talk about on the site, kind of 20 years of warnings that have been ignored. Your collapse timeline goes back to Ross Anderson's 2001 economics paper and runs through SNEER, Flake, DARPA's, Cyber Grand Challenge. What does it say about our industry that every one of these warnings has been ignored for 20 plus years? Is it a failure of imagination, competing incentives, or the threat wasn't visceral enough? Like, what do you think is driving us to kind of, people have been warning about this, right, for 20 plus years, these challenges, these problems, basically.
Yeah, look, I think we have with Bruce Schneier, with so many folks just being very deep in economics as well, people who explained this multiple times over the last decade, what is going wrong. I mean, just looking at our society and all the other domains, school, police, whatever, healthcare, safety is always solved by the state and not really by individuals. So they are really pushing hard for the right regulations. I mean, obviously regulations can be very, very wrong, and we see some of that right now happening in Europe around the AI. We can talk about that, but I feel there's definitely a lack of incentives as well. You've wrote a lot about that, Chris. This has to change, and I think what we just need to realize is, and the clock is showing us this very well. There's a clear trend, and we don't want to be doomsdayers in cybersecurity, but we have to be realists as well, and we have somehow to transport the message to a specific number. That's what I was trying to do with the clock as well, where just looking back, for instance, at our patching cycles, right? We see today, based on the clock, the average, the mean time for an exploit which is being exploited, not for all of the vulnerabilities, but for an exploit which is being exploited for specific vulnerability, it's under 2 days. And then on the other hand, we have, for instance, CISO, for instance, mandating agencies to patch within 14 or 21 days. We have our, Patch Tuesday, our 30-day cycle. I think Patch Tuesday is that, if you ask me, right? If it comes down to people who now have the intent to go after all these organizations and exploit them, we have to change the way as well how we live and breathe security. Everything from patching processes up to disclosure models of vulnerabilities. So I'm not sure if you looked already into that. There were already multiple warnings in the last few years about that, and now we start to see, hey, out of the sudden the team is able to find like 500 to 200 vulnerabilities in kernels just within a couple of days. So how do we deal with that? Or do we have the right teams to go ahead and fix them and even validate them? I think there's a lot of questions mark right now.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the EU, for example, because I just actually published a piece this morning on the latest U.S. cybersecurity strategy, and in there, like the prior administration had an emphasis on shifting the burden to those that make software and products and so on, right? This one takes a different approach where it tries to impose consequences on malicious actors, but it also has a big emphasis on deregulation, right? The complexities of multiple, duplicative, overlapping, cumbersome compliance regimes. And like we see some of that with EU, right, playing out. But then in the US, you have the polar opposite where it's a push for deregularization. But as you point out in the things that you highlighted on the site, we've seen this story before, right? Like the market is not just going to altruistically, invest in security and start making things secure without regulatory forces at play. A point that Bruce Schneier made as well, as you point out. So I think it's interesting that we have these two kind of case studies of the EU and US playing out in different examples of that. And you talked about the advisory piece right there. You also talk about this on the site. I think you cite is Havlar Flake is his name. 2004 had an insight that the patch is the advisory. And you talk about this a little bit, how
Right.
AI can reverse engineer a patch, identify the underlying flaw, generate a working exploit in minutes before most organizations even start to patch their testing cycle. Does that functionality mean coordinated disclosure models are broken? And if so, like what replaces that? What does the future look like?
Yeah, Chris, perhaps let me comment quickly a bit on the regulation itself, because I feel EU is trying to do the right thing, but on the other hand, just looking at the regulation, trying to regulate AI, technology we don't understand. We've ended up in a situation where attackers can now use AI. They are clearly as well, and they have clearly an advantage as well to use AI right now for offense purposes. And then to introduce now an AI-based system in an enterprise environment, you most likely are going to get now questions because of the AI Act, because it's a system which is used for security and safety, right? And, I start to see already a lot of questions around all that. I think the intent was good, but I feel sometimes we tend to overregulate. And my mental model to that is very, very easy. John Elstree, Bruce Schneier was suggesting this already years ago. We have already regulation which is outcome-based and which is working. This is a criminal law, for instance, facing individuals. So we regulate the outcome of a certain individual organization. Why don't we just stick to that instead of just suggesting and describing to the individuals, organizations, societies what they have to do? I feel that's something we have still to relearn again. Yeah, you've mentioned all the this approach from Thomas Dulin, Flake, who wrote about that already ages ago. And actually, I've spoke to Thomas as well when releasing the clock. And the approach is, just to explain this as well to the audience, is a pretty easy one. So whenever you're receiving a patch, you're pretty much receiving a blueprint to the exploit, because the patch is trying to patch the exploit. So there's some insights what can be done. Now it turns out that the AI is pretty good at reconstructing the patches, trying to understand as well the technology, and then building as well an exploit based on that. I don't think that we see right now an industrialization around this specific topic, but I'm pretty sure nation states are working on that. Just because it's that simple, and that approach was already used in the past by nation states. I think the crazy part of this is what's going to happen if somebody just builds out this big lab, with all the standard software, and whenever there's a new patch, they could immediately, within a couple of hours or even minutes, create an exploit and start the exploitation campaign. What does it mean as well to everything we've been building on the other side? Obviously, we need to invest in much more safer, secure software, but on the other hand, it means as well it's not going to help. So we need as well to compensate, with everything we've been working on around zero trust, around introducing more resilience, around detection and response as well, because you have simply to assume breach, right? Cybersecurity hasn't changed just because of AI. It's just shifting certain approaches, in a different way. So it feels to me we need to understand as well how we can use AI now for our advantage. And they have a very interesting thesis as well, which builds on Verifier's law. Chris, so happy just to reflect on that one as well, and then hear your opinion about that.
Yeah, and the last piece, you say something from CISA. Is that what you said?
No,
Sorry,
sure.
your signal broke up. You said you want to
Again.
hear my perspective
Yeah.
on something, but I did think it was interesting. You mentioned the outcome-based approach that Jen Easterly and Bruce and others have talked about. I had an interview with Jim Dempsey of Cyber Lawfare on before, and he had a similar approach around software liability and outcome-based approaches to regulatory approaches for cybersecurity. So folks should check that one out. But I did want to ask you, I talked about this in the video I made, is one of the arguments I made is that, there necessarily wasn't a discovery problem. It's not that AI hasn't made incredible strides in discovery, but, remediation has longstanding been the challenge. And I feel like AI is, supercharging that with, finding vulnerabilities both for offensive, defensive purposes. But the bottleneck is, kind of actually fixing things in complex enterprise environments. What are your thoughts on the zero-day clock's trajectory? Do you see it changing if we can bring AI-assisted remediation into the picture, or where do you think that has a place?
Yeah, I think we have definitely certain advantages, and while we see the offense has an advantage around the objectives, objective validators, that's where I can be very successful. I think for the defense side, there's an advantage around our data, about our environment, about our companies, processes, about our infrastructure. And, we start to see that as well in some of the AI attacks. We've got, for instance, recently an attack in AWS environment, which went from 0 to full admin within 8 minutes. And what was interesting about that attack, you start to see the AI just doing a lot of calls, for instance, calling a GitHub repository which doesn't exist, or creating a specific user account which doesn't exist, and then using this, and the account name would be then called based on the AI name, or trying to use an existing account, an account actually which doesn't exist. So there's a lot of things which the AI is doing, which we would call hallucination, but actually it's not a hallucination aspect. It's more, I think, a result of what the AI was trained on. So all the data which came into the training is something which the AI remembered, and then it's trying just to perform these activities. So one of the theses I think we could explore is if the AI is really trying to behave based on its accent, right? It's learned during the training. We can start looking for that, and we can start measuring as well if the AI is misbehaving, if certain calls are being made to certain things which do not exist. So defenders start to own the validation on the environment we're working in, And I think that's something we need to explore further. In the past, we've tried to, to work already with behavior analysis and with, whitelists as well. I don't think that we were very successful as an industry adopting this proportionally to other components and other controls. But I feel that's the only chance right now from a detection response point of view to be really at the same on par with the offense advantages the AI is providing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially in this non-deterministic, unpredictable behavior of AI. The static-based, rule-based, detections are they can be useful, but we're going to need anomalous behavioral kind of observation, observability, runtime detection and response, like the things that you were just touching on there, to really be effective. One thing I do like about the zero-day clock and the site that you stood up is you also highlight a call to action. And I'm curious, like when you look at that, what do you think will actually move the needle? You have 10 demands ranging from vendor liability, memory safe language mandates, redesigning regulation for machine speed defense. I also like the aspect of including kind of attackers and researchers, or not attackers, but researchers into, policy making. Like these are big structural changes, not necessarily, tactical kind of changes. Realistically, when you look at those demands, what do you think has the best chance of being adopted in, say, the next 3 to 5 years and making the most impact out of the kind of call to action items you listed?
Right. I mean, Chris, you said already that there's no silver bullet in cybersecurity. I don't think that there's like the one solution which is going to move the needle. But I think the most important one is potentially we should just stop asking if we're compliant. We should just ask ourselves if we're faster. Because right now, also a lot of the compliance frameworks we've built we've built them sort of for the past, they're changing right now. So the only constant is becoming speed across all the domains. And that's where I feel we need to optimize. So looking at, how quickly we release, how quickly we patch, how quickly we release new software and rebuild our entire environment, right? Phil Venables was, for instance, instrumental in creating the thesis that instead of just buying security software, you need as well secure software, and that means pretty much that you can rebuild all entire software, all entire products. I don't know, once in a day or a couple of hours in a day, and just by doing that, always try to update the hygiene in your environment instead of waiting for 30 days before you do that. There's a bunch of areas we can improve. Rob Lee called out again the part that we need now to double down on AI adoption for defense. Again, that's a very regulatory type of questions, but also it's a skill set question. So we have a bunch of people out there who never worked in security. Now we can activate those individuals. I don't think that AI is going to reduce the number of individuals and professionals in cybersecurity. If then it will just increase. We need more people than ever in this space. And I think that's also a call out just to bring more people on the table and try to help to stay resilient in this times of uncertainty.
Yeah, a few things you said there I want to double click on is talked about the latest U.S. national cyber strategy. It does mention agentic AI and scaling that for enterprise defenses. So I was glad to see that. And then to your point of using AI as a kind of a force multiplier, knowing that we have the ever-present workforce challenges in cybersecurity. You brought up the topic of kind of dynamic, ephemeral, architectures and environments that you can tear down and rebuild to kind of minimize dwell time of attackers and things of that nature. So again, there's no silver bullets, but there are a lot of things I think we can do to make a lot of impact as well. So I want to ask you kind of a closing question. Maybe we end on an optimistic note here. What should a CISO do on Monday morning, right? The zero-day clock is a kind of an effective wake-up call, but it can also be overwhelming or paralyzing when you look at the figures and it just feels like you're damned, right? It's like for a CISO or security leader reading this or listening to the conversation, looking at the zero-day clock, they agree that the monthly pack cycles are kind of theater and ineffective, so on and so forth. What does a realistic, defensible posture look like? What are some things that you would, recommend, people start doing differently, for example?
Yeah, look, I think the clock was not really a surprise for anybody out there working in our industry. But what the clock does very well is it creates this number, this slide, this one single slide you can take to your board members, to your senators, to your journalists, to your business teams, and then try to visualize the challenge we're facing right now. And to me, what's important is just it's like with the AI transformation. You wanna lead from the top. I still feel that we're talking a lot about security at the board level, but then when it comes to doing real security, after you've reported certain issues, you get as a CISO all the homework to go back and fix all of that. And I think we need to change that. And I hope that the clock is a contribution to that. Just having this one single slide, going to the board members, and then ask them, hey, help me now to enable all of my colleagues running all these different business departments and taking an action point to help solve that going forward. I feel that would be the most powerful play we can derive from that. I don't know. How about you, Chris? What do
No,
you think?
I agree with that. It's like, the phrase, a picture speaks 1,000 words, or whatever the phrase is. Like, you look at that and you're like, okay, like whatever we've been doing is not working. We can't continue the behavior of the past and expect a different result. Kind of the phrase of insanity, doing the same thing, right? Expecting a different result. So it is a wake up call, and it's very powerful. I love it. And I think even just if we can get, policymakers and, as you said, regulators, et cetera, to take action on just some of the call to action items, like we could see a massive systemic impact and change. So I am hopeful, but I also think that we are in for some turbulent times ahead as we see, AI accelerate exploitation, things of that nature. So Sergej, thanks so much for jumping on here. I appreciate it. I know you got a tight turnaround on your end, so I appreciate you jumping on, and I'll get everyone pointed over to the 0 day clock, and keep doing all the awesome stuff you're doing for the community.
Amazing, Chris. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.